1. We are recording MassComm 105 on Tuesday, September 1st, 2020. So happy September to my diversity and media class. Today we have a very special guest we're going to get right to. I just want to make some quick announcements. Juan Cerna is there with the green background, our director of productions. Normally we'd be doing this at our TV studio, but since we can't be on campus, Juan's going to keep an eye on me today so I don't lose it. Thank you, Juan, for being here. And our very special guest today is someone that I had a chance to meet over the summer when his department, the Fremont Police Department, in the city of Fremont, hired me and 2 of our university colleagues to facilitate some discussions about race and policing in Fremont because they'd had a protest, as you well know. You watched the video that I interviewed with him a few weeks ago. So Sean, I'm going to bring you in right now and say, we're going to pick up that conversation, but this time I brought along a few friends. Is that okay?
It's fine by me. I appreciate it.
All right, very good. And there was a story you told me after the recording you forgot to tell. Today is your chance to tell that story. You want to start with that so we don't forget it?
Sure. Let me, sorry, so a couple of pop-ups just came on my screen here. Let me exit out of there.
That's right. You're actively working as we're doing this.
Yeah, I'm trying to close out my email so it doesn't disrupt the computer. But yeah, first of all, I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity to be with you and your students. I think it's fantastic as a grad of San Jose State. I always welcome the opportunity to speak to the students, as well as this very important topic. So I will speak a little bit about just my perspective, as a police commander, having a lot of experience on the police force, and as well as an African-American male in this country right now. And so there are some trying times, for sure. But the story that Bob referenced is my own kind of interaction with the recent protests that we've seen throughout the country. And so the city of Fremont was not immune to that as well. We did have a series of protests that came to our police department, which was good, right? First Amendment, right? We all have it. We should embrace that. I certainly embrace it as long as nothing is broken and people aren't hurt, right? Those are the 2 things for me that transitions from a protest to violence and criminal acts. But one of the things that really struck me about the recent protest was just the emotion that has been involved in the folks that participated. In fact, it struck me that how hurt our community has been and continues to be over these type of situations that we've seen on television. And so, you know, I interact with the protesters quite a bit. I make it a point to go out and speak to them as much as I can. And so one of the things that was asked of me was would I be willing to kneel in solidarity with the protesters? And so it caught me a little bit off guard initially because I wasn't quite certain what they were asking me to do. And so once they explained that they were hurting, and they wanted a partnership. They wanted to build that relationship with their police department in a way that we could at least show some compassion towards the pain that they feel. And so for me, it was an easy decision. Absolutely, I will kneel with you in solidarity to unite the message of speaking out against injustices that have occurred in this country at the hands of the police. And so that was my background and where I grew up. I grew up in Los Angeles. I was racially profiled as a youth. So I've experienced a lot of those things. So it was very easy for me to understand what the protesters were asking me to do. So I did kneel in solidarity with the protesters, which was, I feel, the right thing to do from my perspective. However, I quickly realized that not all the police officers shared the same experiences that I've gone through, and maybe felt like, uncomfortable joining me in kneeling with the protesters. It's one thing to keep in mind. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And from my perspective, because I consider a unique perspective growing up where I grew up, and I quickly made that connection with members of our community. That doesn't necessarily mean the officers who chose not to kneel are wrong, okay? What's beautiful about this country is we all get to choose our causes. We all get to choose what we feel is important. And we need to stand on the shoulders of that foundational level set of rights. And so I don't look bad upon anyone who chooses not to kneel, just like I wouldn't expect them to look or frown upon me because I chose to do that and show some compassion to the community. Now, it is my job as a leader to try to offer some perspective to my peers on why I made that decision and why I think, quite frankly, it's important to show that solidarity and that compassion to our community who's hurting right now. But it definitely was a first for our organization to have to deal with those type of conversations and, should we do this? Should we not do that? And it took a lot for me to even reach out to officers who chose not to do it and try to understand their perspective, because it was hard for them to hear some of the comments that were being directed towards the police department. Some productive and some very hurtful and unproductive. I will have to admit that. So anyway, I just wanted to share that and see if you guys had any questions about that. But it was something for our department we had to deal with internally, and we had various opinions on whether or not that was the right thing to do for me. I feel good about it. I still support my decision. I was the only person at the department that chose to do that. But again, that's okay. That's okay, because I know there are a lot of other law enforcement officers, you've seen the images around the country, that chose to do that. And not everybody did. And so it is an individual choice. I think it's the right choice by me, just based on, my perspective and what I felt at that particular time.
Sean, thank you for that. And very quickly, before we get to the students' questions, we've been monitoring news developments in this latest, for us, the first week in September, of the issues in Wisconsin, in Kenosha. And today, the President of the United States is going there to try to calm the waters, he says. What does that present for police officers? One, when the President of the United States shows up anywhere, and two, in the middle of this type of situation?
Well, that's a great question, because it's complex. It's a complex issue for sure. So there's a couple of things in there. I know, having been on a security detail for both Barack Obama when he came to town, Bill Clinton, and then the current Vice President Pence, the amount of resources that it takes to help protect the president. So when you're in the midst of an emergency, that is a consideration, that if the president or a VIP comes to town, the amount of resources that it's going to produce to protect that person could potentially take away from what you might be dealing with at that particular time, whether it be a protest or anything else. Layered on top of that is if that VIP or representative of our government is going to descend upon that area, we need that to be a productive visit, to where it's going to calm or help diffuse some of the anxiety that particular community is experiencing. And so, depending on what side of the political aisle you're on, that you may have confidence that is going to happen, or maybe you don't. But because it's uncertain, I think that's the level of, I think some of the law enforcement professionals feel a little uncomfortable about the visit because there is that uncertainty whether it's going to help or hurt in what we're trying to accomplish, which is public safety. That's what we're charged with. So there are definitely some concerns out there, but we're crossing our fingers to hope that it works out, and the words that are used, the comments, help unite us and not divide us, and that can either fuel the fire or bring us together and start to calm things down, and we can get some productive, meaningful conversations initiated.
All right, thank you, Sean. We're going to start then with the students' questions. We have 37 students in our class here today, and we'll start with Christian Moreno, the first question.
Okay, so my question is more focused on brutality. And, police officers, they see the worst of the worst. They see shootings, stabbings, children being mistreated. And years back, I had a family friend who was an officer here in the Los Angeles area. And the job really got to his head, and he ended up developing PTSD that went undetected. And unfortunately, he took his own life. And my question is for you is, what does your department specifically do to make sure that the mental health of the officers are okay, to make sure they don't do anything that they aren't supposed to that could be triggered by something?
Fantastic question, and thank you for that. I'm sorry for the loss of that particular officer. Unfortunately, it is a reality of our job because of the stress. And so departments should have a very robust employee wellness program. That's financial wellness, that's physical wellness, and mental wellness. That last piece, mental wellness, has historically been something that police agencies were slow to adopt as an important part of the job. And it goes back decades to where, hey, if you see something that is disturbing, you just need to tough it out and deal with it. And that's what makes you tough. And, but the piece of we're all human beings was left out of that. So what we started to experience is, unfortunately, exactly what you're talking about. The wear on police officers started to take its toll. And so, every department should have some sort of employee wellness to have those supportive systems in place, whether it's mandated counseling after a significant event, peer support programs, financial well-being, counseling, marriage counseling. All of those things play an important part. Why? Well, it's important for two reasons. We care about each other. That's the most important thing. We care about our officers. But also we owe it to the community for that officer to be as supported as they can, financially, physically, and mentally, so that they can provide proper service to the community. So it's in the best interest of the community that the police departments invest in those sorts of programs to help support the officers. So we have one here in Fremont that is, we feel is very robust. We've had it for years under Craig Steckler, who was the chief years and years and years ago. He developed the program. We have peer support. We have mentors. We have mental health professionals on standby that can be called 24 hours a day. We check in on our employees. We show them the support. We implement nutritional support and wellness, as well as we allow our officers to work out on duty paid in order to keep their physical well-being up as well. So those are some of the things that we're doing here in Fremont. I'm sure it's not the best program, but we feel very confident that we're far along that path to support our employees.
Christian, thank you for that question, and I'm sorry about your friend. That's horrible, man. Our thoughts for you on that one. I mentioned the other day 2 other students should be ready to ask questions. Raise your hand if I told you to be ready. Okay, Ray, you're next.
Hi, Captain.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great.
Good. So what I wanted to talk about was It's not about Wisconsin or anything. There was a situation in New York last week between two males on a subway ride. Um, and they ended up getting into a physical altercation and ended up getting to a point where four Swedish police officers who were actually on vacation were on the train and ended up de-escalating the fight. And they held the suspects down until the police arrived. Now, if we compared American forces to those in Europe, for example, why is it that American police use so much more force than those in Europe? And is there a way for American police to do their job without using as much force?
Well, great question. Thank you for that question. The culture is different here in America. That's just the bottom line. We here in America, we embedded in our Constitution is our right to bear arms and all those other sorts of things. So our culture is just different, for sure. But what we're starting to see, and some lessons that we can learn from other cultures and other countries, is that there may be an opportunity to limit police officer roles and to certain aspects of the job that don't necessarily require a person carrying a badge and a gun. So I can't speak to the specifics. I haven't studied that particular issue in particular, or comparing us against other countries and how they do business. But you mentioned something like de-escalation. You're starting to hear that in the news quite a bit now, right? I mean, we've always understood that there is a place for de-escalation, but now it's in the forefront where the community is demanding those type of tactics be utilized. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. We're charged with the safety and security of all citizens, all community members. And so it's in the best interest, if that's our job, even if we have to use some force, we have a duty to care for the individual that we use force on. And so you're starting to hear that as well throughout our community. This is one thing that I think the pendulum is starting to swing in the direction that you're starting to suggest, is that we are starting to think about law enforcement differently and different options on how we can resolve certain situations. But we're not there yet. We're certainly well along the path of where we were, say, in the 60s, but we're not where we need to be. And so we just have to keep moving down that path and exploring some of these options that you're referencing. So that's a great point. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
No, I appreciate the answer, Captain.
Alejandra, you're next. Delgado.
Hello. So my question is, did you see any favoritism towards officers of color in the police force after major protests, just so that the public would have a more positive impact and to de-escalate the situation?
You said like favoritism towards minority?
Yeah, so towards officers of color, just so like the public would have a more positive reaction towards the police workforce.
No, I haven't experienced that at all. You mean like using an African-American officer maybe to talk to the community and those type of things? Well, so I haven't used that. That hasn't been a strategy, at least at our department. I'm not saying that that doesn't exist. But here's one thing to keep in mind. Like I said before, I have a different perspective. And so if we're talking to people who are hurting, and let's just take one group, a group of African-Americans at a local church, I'm going to speak to that group a little bit differently than maybe an officer that doesn't have the background or perspective that I have. It just makes sense, right? I grew up in LA, inner city. I was stopped by LAPD illegally. I was put out, drug out of the car and proned out. And I know that it was unjustified use of authority. I lived through the LA riots. My dad was a police officer down there at the time. And so it's not necessary, I don't think it would necessarily be a bad thing for me to go with my colleague who may be of a different background and race to have this conversation and dialogue, because A, I'm going to be able to offer perspective, and that officer that may not have my perspective may gain perspective by engaging in that dialogue. So we haven't strategically placed African-American officers in certain positions for that purpose. We were actually accused of that during one of the protests because the chief was out of the area, and it was myself and another African-American captain that went out to address the group. And they said, well, you brought out the black captains just to kind of play to the crowd, but we only have 3 captains. 1 is white, 2 are black, and the one was in charge of the white captain was in charge of the overall operation, and the 2 that were left happened to be myself and my colleague. So anyway, hopefully that answered your question, but yeah, I wouldn't play games with trying to, I wouldn't play games with trying to select people just to appease a crowd, because that's dangerous. You're really not listening. You're talking at people instead of talking to people. So that would be my response.
Amani Ahmed.
Sorry, it's Amani.
Amani, I stand corrected. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Captain Washington.
How are you?
So, good, how are you?
Thanks, good.
You mentioned that our culture in America is different, and I would have to agree with that, especially now that our culture as Americans and our police culture is under scrutiny from the rest of the world. Our culture seems to have a lot of roots in violence and white supremacy, and that extends to police culture being rooted in violence and white supremacy. How can we expect a culture rooted in violence and white supremacy to police people of color with justice and equity?
Great question. The first step is not denying our history, recognizing it. You know, what we try to do, I think, in my humble opinion, as a society, we try to forget about what the 60s was like, the 50s, the 40s. We try to forget how the police were utilized, you know, to oppress certain groups and those type of things. Let's not forget that history. And it's recent history, right? This is not ancient history. So to expect that we've evolved in, you know, a few decades to where all of our problems are solved, that's just unrealistic. And so it's continuing down the path. I truly believe that individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., those are the core principles we need to do to initiate, to continue the conversation and continue pushing us down the path of how policing should be. We are not there yet. We're better off than we were several decades ago, but we still have a long way to go. And so there aren't going to be any you know, right answers today to where we're going to snap our fingers and tomorrow things are going to magically be better for everyone, all community members. It's just not going to happen. But our job in this particular time, 2020, is to keep pushing the conversation down the road, getting better year after year, decade after decade, and try to achieve perfection. Even knowing we're dealing with human beings will never achieve perfection, we have to keep the conversation going. I can tell you, I'm not that old, but you know, compared to some of you, you might certainly think so. But I just know we've come a long way, even in my lifetime. And then you take someone like my dad and you have conversations with him about how things were when he grew up. It's a whole different level. So I was talking to Bob about the conversation that a lot of African Americans have with young males about how to respond when you're stopped by the police, right? And I certainly had that conversation with my dad, who was a police officer. But my dad, prior to him passing away, told me that his conversation when he grew up and he was a teenager was quite different. It was how not to get lynched and killed by the police or a group by looking at a woman, a white woman, you know, as you walk down the street and those type of things. So, you know, you have that perspective from him. Although we have isolated incidents, those conversations are at least not as extreme as they were back then, but they still are happening, just in a different form, and we have to continue that conversation. So anyway, that's my perspective on that.
Great question. Great question, Amani. I appreciate that very much. John Maxwell. You're next.
Hi. So I have like a pretty straightforward question for the most part. So I guess it's kind of like more of like a twofold experience, but throughout your history as being a police officer, have you ever encountered a situation where one of your fellow colleagues may have racially profiled a person and try to go after them? And like, oh shoot, I'm so sorry about that.
All right.
But, and then if you have like, what do you exactly do in that type of situation? Like, how do you de-escalate that like situation? Like, how do you avoid that situation?
So I'm fortunate enough to say I have never experienced that as a police officer, flat out. I've never seen it. I've never suspected it. I've never witnessed it. And those who know me know that I would not put up with that. So if it did occur, I think we have a duty to intervene. This badge means a lot to me. And to disrespect it, to use it inappropriately, to betray the trust of our community can't happen. Those values were instilled upon me by my dad, my desire to be in the profession. So I am lucky enough to report confidently, I've never seen that when I've been on duty. I'm not naive to believe that it doesn't happen, right? In fact, as a professional, I've never experienced it. However, in my life before a police officer, absolutely I experienced it. So I know it exists. So I'm sorry I couldn't give you a specific example because I just have not experienced that in my particular department, but I know how I would react if that was something that I saw and observed. I have a duty to intervene, I have a duty to report, and I have an obligation to our community to ensure that we're policing the right way.
Gotcha.
Thank you. Thank you. Courtney Vasquez, you're next.
Okay, hello. I just had a question kind of, I guess you could say like on the other side, because personally my dad is a police officer. So, you know, I hear about the job a lot and stuff. But I was kind of wondering in this day and age of like social media and stuff, there's a lot of either like one-sided, it's always kind of difficult that way. But I was wondering, how do you think Americans can try to understand like the intensity of the job that a police officer has, especially in like high intensity situations and arrests? Obviously, with Jacob Blake and George Floyd, you know, did not have to escalate to those kind of things. But you know, I guess for me, I know that my dad and his colleagues have had like high intensity arrests where they resort to violence and stuff like that. So I guess from you, how do you think people could try to understand that? Because I know, you know, people don't always understand and don't know the risks and everything that police officers are taking.
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, thank your dad for his service. Thank you for your sacrifice, because behind every police officer is a supportive family that allows them to do their job. And so thank you. To answer the second part of your comment, how can we kind of communicate with the public on, you know, all the stressors and things that officers go through? Well, you're part of it right now. So this is one way to do it, right? To explain, to see the human side of policing and the person behind the badge. One thing we have not done a good job of as a profession is telling our story. That's on us. So if you don't tell your story, people will go with what they see on social media. They will go what they see on TV, and that will determine their impression of what law enforcement is. Well, that may be good or bad. And so there is another side to policing that needs to be told. And I think we're starting to learn that lesson now as a profession. And so I encourage folks all the time to, when I say folks, law enforcement agencies, to tell your story. A quick example, I used to be in charge of our crowd control response team. And so I was on the front line with the officers as to mitigate crowd, civil unrest. And I do know that 95 or higher % of the individuals that are out there are peacefully protesting. However, there's a small group that are there to just destroy things and hurt people. And so what does the news capture? The news will capture our attempts, law enforcement's attempts to mitigate destruction of property and violent acts. And that's what's shown on TV. Not the 5 hours I was standing out there having a very productive conversation with a group of protesters. That doesn't, I mean, there's no clicks. Is that what you guys call it? There's no money in those type of clicks, right? And so for years, I remember we were up in Oakland about 5 years ago, and there were a group of, just a very small group of about 5,000 folks, but there were a group of about 20 that had a box that we seized of hammers that were painted black. The ends were sharpened, and they were intending to throw them at law enforcement. We never told that story. So why didn't we get in front of folks within the media and say, yes, there was a small group. Yes, 99% were peaceful, but there was this small group, and here are the weapons that they utilized, right? No one knows that story. We as law enforcement know it, but the public should know that as well, just to give a balanced perspective. So I guess that's a long way to say that we need to do a better job of telling our story and putting a human behind the badge. And I think that will help both sides come to the middle a little bit.
And I'm very glad you shared that story, because I keep hounding the media about why don't we hear those other stories? They're definitely out there for sure. Ariana Hernandez is next.
Okay, so the question I thought of was kind of like, I wrote it down so I could remember. In the video that Bob had showed us earlier of the previous conversation you guys had, you said something about like the anger to protest is important, and it's coming from sadness and fear and disappointment from the officers. And you said we can't be offended by that. And I have a family member, a cousin who's a police officer. He just became a police officer, so he's only been in the force for like a year. But he posts on social media that he is frustrated and that he is offended by people who are angry at the police. So if you have any like colleagues that seem to have that too, like an offense, or like if you can give some kind of incentive of like what kind of conversation I could have with him as to like trying to make him understand that it's okay to be frustrated.
Yeah. And it is okay for the police officer to be frustrated, but my point in that was we shouldn't be offended. Because here's where I stand on it. I'm not offended by our community speaking out against the death of George Floyd and similar deaths, right? If we can all agree that the cases in which we know are excessive force, criminal acts by policing, there is no debate there. If we can all agree, if we can just start from that point, and I think I saw a poll that like 80-something% of America believes that George Floyd killing was a criminal act, unjustified, all that other type of stuff. So I don't feel offended that my community speaks out against that, because I will join them and speak out against that as well. In fact, the badge requires that. If this represents justice, law, order, protection, and all those things were violated by someone who wore this badge, why wouldn't I join the community in speaking out against that? And so I don't feel offended by that. Now, what your family member, was it your brother or?
It's my cousin.
Oh, cousin. What your family member may be experiencing, and what I would ask he or she to do, is to isolate the issues. It's hard for me to hear calls for that you know, my agency is racist, that I'm racist, that I'm a sellout, I'm an Uncle Tom, I'm one of them. I've heard it all. It's hard for me to hear that, but it's coming from a place of frustration. And there are extremes on each side, right? There's folks who say abolish the police. Okay, obviously I don't believe that. There's folks who say the police they should be doing what they're doing and no changes are needed. Those are the extremes. The answer typically is in the middle. that's the majority of society, is in the middle. Yes, we need to do better. Yes, we need the police, however. And those are the things. So I would just ask that you urge him to isolate the issues of what his frustration is. I don't know if you said it was male or female, it doesn't matter. Isolate what the issue is and focus that frustration on doing something good, because it's okay. Because see, I also see through not knowing your family member that some of the frustration they might feel is that they're offended by it because they know that they are not what is being portrayed on TV. Okay, and so I could see that side of it. But don't be offended by it, because the First Amendment protects the right to peacefully assemble. And that's the only way we're going to affect change. If they didn't march in the 60s, where would we be today? They didn't protest in the 60s and years before then, where would we be today? And so we're in the midst of another evolution, another advancement in law enforcement. And I would say we should embrace that. We're going to be better as a result of this, not worse. So anyway, hopefully that helps.
That point, very well taken. I always remind students, back when I was growing up, San Jose State didn't hire African-American faculty. So I wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for the 1960s and their protests. Candace Farmer, you're next.
Hi, Captain.
Hi.
I was wondering, even though, you know, you're in such a high position in the police department, have you ever faced difficulty with people, other police officers, seeing you as an authoritative figure, whether in your department or in other departments, and how you go about handling that?
Well, can you clarify the authoritative figure, you know, for my position, or is it the position and my race, a combination? Is that what you're?
Right, yeah. So I mean, just maybe simple like interactions where it's just kind of like you just get that feeling of like, oh, okay, like you don't quite take me, you know, as seriously as you would if I weren't Black.
Yes and no. So I'm fortunate enough to work for an agency that I have not really experienced that. I've ascended the ranks based on, I'd like to think, merit. I've done everything I think I should do to position myself quite well, which includes graduating from San Jose State with a master's degree to use that to my advantage. But I have been in training courses where there has been quite the surprise. So when I'm not in this uniform, I look quite different. But there's quite the surprise about my rank and about my accomplishments. And you just get taken back from that, because it's almost like, really? That's not what the person expected me to say, right? But you know, though we have to understand that police officers, although we try to hire folks with different perspectives and people who are accepting of others, they're a reflection of our society, the police ranks. So you are going to have folks that have certain opinions and beliefs that are rooted in, you know, some traditional thoughts that doesn't align with what we would think, you know, law enforcement is supposed to have. So I haven't experienced a lot of that in my agency, but I have experienced that in like various training courses throughout the state, where there are opinions and thoughts that you're like, wow, that is so like 1940s, 50s, and here we are in 2020, and we're having the same type of conversations about race and equity and those type of things. So
We are about 30 minutes before the end of the class, 30 minutes. Brooks Rossi is next. Is Brooks around? Okay. Then let's go to Brian So.
I guess my question is all about, like, how after all these have happened, people are talking about the slogan defund the police. I just wanted to get your opinions on what exactly you think that means and how to clarify that whole topic of conversation.
Yeah, and I'll spoke on this a little bit earlier, so I'll try to make this. I try not to repeat myself, but I think defund the police means different things to different people, right? So what I'd like to see is a real definition of it, like, because there's folks who are saying, no, when we say defund the police, we don't mean abolish the police. We mean maybe reallocate some resources to other supportive services that will ease the burden on the police. For instance, dealing with those who suffer from mental illness. I support wholeheartedly coming up with a program or a team that can go out and respond to those type of individuals, right? We don't have the training and expertise to deal with that. So we're the available resource, but may not be the correct or right or appropriate resource. But we're 24-hour a day operation, 365 days a year. And when you call 911, someone picks up and we will respond. So, it's a complex question because defund means something to different people. From my perspective, I truly believe we need to increase funding in certain categories to help better prepare police, to give more training, to ensure we're hiring the right people, all those sorts of things. So when I hear defunding, as long as you're not taking away funds that support what we need to do to keep the community safe, I am supportive of that. But if you're talking about taking away funding that makes our community less safe, yeah, I push back on that.
Lester Vinoringen.
Hello, Captain.
Hi.
So I just wanted to create a scenario, like if an officer were to commit a crime, what determines the type of punishment or consequence that they would receive? Because from what we've seen, some would be temporary, like they would be placed on temporary leave off their job. They would be relocated to another department, or in most cases, like they would be fired. So like, what would warrant their type of punishment?
Like the extreme punishment, like firing, or is that what you're? Yeah, so there's the Police Officers Bill of Rights has some protections in there for police officers. It's basically like a court proceeding. The officers have rights to defend themselves, and they hire a lawyer, and they can come in and present their case and all those other sorts of things. But in the extreme cases where there is actual criminal behavior, we're talking like George Floyd type stuff. Yeah, that officer's done, gone. There's no tolerance for that type of behavior. Now, I'm saying that from my perspective. To your point, probably that does not always occur like it should. And that's where we have to advance and get better. But there is a process. Every police department should have some sort of review, use of force process, or whatever it is, whatever the conduct is. If it's criminal versus a policy violation, those are two different things. If you have a criminal violation, that takes it to a whole nother level. And that's where the lawyers and everything gets involved. If there's a lower level policy violation, like you ran a red light or something like that, that's handled internally, administratively, in which the department will render some sort of finding and we will hand out discipline. The criminal side of it is handled outside of the department by the district attorney's office, and then they will make their finding whether or not this person should be held criminally liable for their actions. So there's a mix of remedies embedded in that, and we just have to determine where that falls.
Okay. Thank you.
I definitely have to call on the dynamic duo now, Shannon and Madison. Each of you get to ask a question. Go for it. Hurry up.
In an earlier interview, you claimed that murdering unarmed Black men goes against what we are about as a profession and a human being. Does this statement apply to police officers and departments that protect officers that murder Black men? As we have seen time and time again, that they are fired and hired somewhere else, or like literally, like most people most police officers who have murdered Black men, unarmed Black men, are oftentimes not punished. Their charges are dropped. They are acquitted. Should those people also be held accountable? The people who protect those officers that murdered Black men?
Absolutely. So I guess my statement embedded in that is that, you know, without a specific example, anytime it is found that an officer is criminally liable for someone's death, they should be held accountable. Absolutely. So I guess we have to filter through the facts of each case versus you know, public opinion on how the case should have been resolved. So that's the difference, without getting into specific examples on whether or not an officer should be held criminally liable or not. I'll just have a quick example. Ferguson, Mike Brown, right? There was a lot of misinformation that went out about the actions of Mr. Brown. Now, Mike Brown was somebody's baby. That was somebody's brother. That was somebody's, no one, I don't want to see anyone lose their life. But the facts of the case, and I've studied it, and you know, you're certainly welcome to challenge me on it. The facts of the case were not as they were portrayed in the media. And so where the public might think that that was an unjustifiable shooting, I differ in my opinion on that. However, I do agree that systemically, the police were used in that particular community to oppress people of color. That absolutely was the case. So I will agree. So I can talk to both things and make a fair assessment without being biased one way or the other. So I guess that's a long way to say absolutely anybody who's held criminally liable for the death of someone, especially wearing the badge, should be held accountable and should not wear the badge.
And the second question from the dynamic duo.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Great, thank you.
Quickly.
So there's been a lot of social experiments and research to show how group polarization works and leads to violence. And there's definitely a really big kind of brotherhood environment in the police department. And, you know, they're very unchecked in a lot of situations. So do you feel that this environment breeds polarization, and how do you feel that qualified immunity plays a role in this?
Yeah, keep me on track because there was a lot of questions in there. So yeah, I mean, sure. There is a brotherhood associated with policing for sure, but not at the expense. And all police departments are not made the same. I have to stress that. Policing in California is different than policing in Alabama. Policing in Fremont is different than policing in San Jose. The cultures, the expectations, the traditions, all those things are different. So it's difficult for me to speak about other police agencies because I reference back to what is the norm here at Fremont. And so we don't experience that culture of protecting each other. In fact, I'm over internal affairs, and I can tell you that I'm certainly not afraid of holding officers accountable. And yeah, I do get that backlash that I'm overly harsh or unfair to the officers and those type of things. But my obligation is to the community to make sure that they're serving properly. I can't be a part of the department that don't have those values. And so growing up where I grew up and experienced what I've experienced. But qualified immunity, that is a federal standard. It doesn't apply at the state level. And so really the foundation of qualified immunity is if you're following the law and you're following your training and or your policies, then really your beef is with the state or the government and not the individual. And so if someone acts outside of that, then that's when they can be personally liable for, you know, causing the death of someone or using too much force and those type of things. So I think it has its place as long as those three things are met. You're following policy, you're following the law, and you're following your training. You know, whatever job you're in, you know, if you're following the rules that the organization has created for you and someone dies as a result or get hurt as a result, then I still think you have an avenue to sue or hold the organization liable but the officer was acting in accordance with those three things. So I think it does have its place in certain situations.
Thank you.
Nadia Momand.
Hey, Captain. So I was gonna ask. So when you guys go to detain somebody, what is the protocol to where multiple officers come in and try to help out? And obviously, we've been seeing videos of excess force and everything going on with that. But with your guys' training, what is the right way to go about it when you detain somebody?
Yeah, tough question to answer without specifics, but I think I get your point on that. So there's two schools of thought. A, you detain someone, you should be detaining someone with a reasonable and necessary amount of force. So what that means, it means something different to probably all of you on this call. For me, I'm an expert in defensive tactics. I was on the SWAT team for 15 years. I am a driving instructor. I was a detective. I played sports in college. So if I have someone that is similar size, that to me, I'm 6'2", 250 pounds. And so if someone, I feel like I may be able to detain that person without using, say, a weapon, maybe go hands-on. Take a smaller officer that's 5'2", 100 pounds. Same scenario, but they need to take that person into custody and that person starts to resist. Would it be reasonable for that smaller officer to use a taser or a baton or something like that? Probably. So it's very individualized. That's why it has to be reasonable and necessary. Is it reasonable for me to use my baton on a 75-year-old, 100-pound, person to take them into custody? The answer would be no. That's ridiculous. Look how big you are. Look at their expertise, your training, all of that stuff. Versus, someone who was smaller or, those type of things. So anyway, it's a complex question, but if you can just remember, it needs to be reasonable and necessary. That's what the law states. And it has to follow our training, again, and our policies. Those things align, you're good to go. Where we get into trouble is where it's unreasonable, like in George Floyd. I can't think of any reason why you would be in that position on someone's back or neck for 9 or 10 minutes. I've been here 23 years. I cannot come up with any justifiable reason why that tactic is appropriate. And so that is unreasonable and unnecessary, and that's why he was charged with the crime.
Brianna Corona.
Hi, Captain. So I know that your father was also a police officer, and I just wanted to know if he ever gave you any kind of advice from his experience with protests and how that advice has helped you during those times.
Yeah, thank you for that. And absolutely, I hold near and dear to my heart the advice that my my father gave me when I was young. He's one of the reasons why I wear the badge now. He's one of the reasons why I stay motivated to improve law enforcement, because he was an example of how to do it the correct way. And so growing up in the neighborhood that we grew up in, I had a unique understanding of the frustrations in 1992 when the LA riots, Rodney King, broke out. I had a unique perspective. I experienced, oh, hi, someone's in the background there. I had a unique perspective of the frustrations of our community, because I had experienced those type of issues, as well as my father's duty to help protect the community by going out there and working the riots. I was scared to death that my dad had to go out there and work the riots because it was dangerous. LA was different. It was different back then. I don't know if you guys are too young to know what the early 90s looked like back in LA, but LA, gang infested, a lot of violence. And so, yeah, if everyone just can pick someone to put in their heart in order to help guide them to do the right thing for the right reasons, I think we'll all be better off. But my father, to your point, was that inspiration for me.
Thank you.
Ali Klotz.
Hi, Captain.
Hi.
So you had mentioned that the policing between departments differs between, say, Fremont and somewhere in Texas. To me, many of the standards that you have seem like very justified, like checking the bad apples, and they seem like they should be universal standards to me. Why do you think that we don't always see these standards across consistently across different departments?
Let me start by saying I agree. Some things need to be standardized, 100%. But we also have to recognize that different communities require different types of policing. And so that's one of the things that I think commanders in different cities will push back on. But there's certain fundamental policing strategies and philosophies that I think we are in an era, and I think it's going to be coming very, very soon, that it will be standardized. Like the reasonable and necessary force standard. That's a California law. There's no reason that can't be applied nationally. There's no reason. It's going to take young folks like you to make that happen. But I told Bob, and he knows that I believe this, we police with the consent of the community. What that means is that you all vote for the people who are in power, and you all give us our authority. So you tell us that it needs to be reasonable and necessary across the board in the US, and that's how we will police. Right now, if you said, nope, I want your uniforms to be polka dots with purple stripes and all this, guess what? That's what I'm gonna wear, because you guys get to determine how we police through your actions, through your vote, through campaigning your legislators, all that other type of stuff. So I would agree with you. We do need a little bit more standardization throughout the nation.
We have about 15 minutes left. Megan Ryan.
Hello. One question I had was, what type of race sensitivity training do you go through? Like, do you have any examples or anything you can share with us? Just because I'm curious.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So the police academy has, I think it's 16 hours. Don't hold me to that because I might be off by 4 or 5 hours one way or the other. So anybody who goes through California Post Police Academy, and Post sets the standards for a police officer. I had to go to the academy way back in the day. I had to qualify and to become a police officer. So you do have that sensitivity training. Racial bias training is due for every police officer in the state of California. Every 5 years, you have to do that training. Fremont, we like to go a little bit above and beyond that because we have a very diverse community to where we want to do in-house training on that, as well as do bias training sooner than every 5 years, so maybe every other year. The other thing is just getting out in the community and interacting with folks, talking, doing things like this. You guys might think this is for you, but it is much for me as it is for you guys. Hearing these questions, even the tough questions, that's good. I'm hearing from the community right now. I'm starting to understand your concerns, your issues. And so that's what we do here in Fremont. I think consistently, most police departments in California do these things, but maybe it's time to go beyond that. I offered up, only a few people know about it, but in my department, if someone wants to go to Memphis, Tennessee and go to the Lorraine Hotel, the museum, the African-American Museum, that's where Martin Luther King was assassinated. That site has been turned into a museum. I'll pay for it. I only can do one person, but that's okay. One person at a time, because getting that perspective is important because we serve a very diverse community and we need to have diverse thoughts in order to effectively serve our community. So that's some of the things we do here in Fremont.
That's a great suggestion. And by the way, we sent 10 of our students from our journalism, advertising, and PR program to that exact location about 12 years ago. And they had a chance to meet with someone who was standing right next to Dr. King when the shot was fired. It's a learning experience to this day. They still talk to me about.
That's
You can't
awesome.
beat it. Kristen Toronto, you're next.
Oh, okay. So hello, Sean, Captain Sean. Good to
How are
see
you?
you. Pretty good, pretty good. I had a pretty simple question. You were talking about in Bob Rucker's interview how during the June 2nd, I believe, protests where Fremont's department saw a lot of protesters come out, and how I specifically want to focus on the fact that you had that kind of like one-on-one moment with that little girl that you saw, and that you were hugging her and all that stuff. I was just kind of curious. You mentioned that how you kind of had to break protocol, right? How you kind of had to break those safety regulations and rules of like, instead of scanning the entire crowd, you kind of focused in on her. I was just kind of curious. I know that like we have human situations where we're all human, and we have those situations where we see that kind of stuff happen. Can't you say the same thing about like how that's kind of a same kind of flawed mentality when talking about policing, especially with other people and other police officers who are the quote unquote bad apples, when they're kind of technically breaking regulations and procedures, especially with the case of George Floyd. I just feel like that, you talk about standardization and talk about like having to have these standard protocols, yet it's kind of hard to do that and have people follow specific protocols when we're all human, and a lot of people still are going to be those bad apples.
Yeah, so two things in that. When I talk about breaking protocols, it's not breaking a rule or a law. It's breaking like expectations. So there's officer safety expectations. That's what I violated, right? So I went, we're supposed to be, here's the police on this side, here are the protesters. We stay over here, they stay over there. There's a neutral zone in the middle. We're all good, right? And so we're taught not to breach that zone, and they don't come across to our zone. But see how that creates an us versus them. And when you have a little girl crying and asking for a hug, we need to break down those walls and just be human beings. And there's someone that needs help. And so it's a violation of our protocols or procedures as far as my own personal safety, because that's a safety rule violation. But what we're talking about with officers being held accountable, those are acts that harm the community, right? And so if you have protocols and procedures that officers are breaking that does harm to the community, that's no go. And so I've yet to see anybody challenge that what I did harmed the community. It was something that I did to try to help a particular member of the community. So that's where I draw the line between the two. A good question.
Ashley Ramos.
Hi, Captain Washington.
Hi.
How are you? I just had a just like super self question, or just like simple question. What would you say to the talking about Jacob Blake, what would you tell the officer that pulled out the gun and shot him 7 times? And I know there's like a group of police officers. What would you tell the officer?
What would I tell the officer right now? So here's the uncomfortable conversation. I got to be full disclosure. I don't have all the facts in the Blake matter, just what you guys have seen on TV as well. And it's certainly disturbing, and it looks very bad. But what I would do, and I think what we need to question as a profession is, was there another way? Was there another way to accomplish the legitimate law enforcement objective that you were set out to do? Was it okay to tactically reposition? Those are the type of questions that I have when I see some of these videos that I don't have all the facts. Is what drove the officers to continue to pursue that individual, which led to the use of force? So is there another way? Was there another tactic? Did we know who the person was? Could we arrest the person later? The fact that the kids were in the car, all of those type of things, that's what I would communicate to that particular officer.
Tiana Lamb.
Hi, so my question was kind of similar to another person's question, but
Very quickly.
how do you think your father would have reacted / what actions would your father would have taken if he were still alive and in the force during this whole BLM movement regarding George Floyd and everything?
Yeah,
From like
I
what
can
he
sum,
has told you.
yeah, I can sum that up pretty quickly. Everything that I've described, I mean, I really think I'm, you know, a clone of my father. So he would have the same reaction, same disturbed images, same thoughts that I would have as we move forward. So I really do think that he would have a similar reaction.
Derek? Oh.
Good afternoon, Captain. My question is, I know you talked about it with Bob in the video a couple weeks ago that you knelt with that young child. I'm just curious, what would you say to children, not only in your community, but also in the Bay Area, about what's going on in our country right now? Because they may be a little too young to understand the difficult situations that you guys have been handling.
Yeah, I would just try to instill the basic values that we all hold as Americans, that we're all people and that we need to come together. What we see on TV, and I blame media on both sides because, right, you have to produce what sells. And so our kids are seeing these images, and this is just not who we are as a country. It's not if you're black or white, A or B, right or wrong. The answer is typically in the middle. And so because there's accusations about the character of people, we've never experienced this as a country. And so all of a sudden now, you know, we have these values that if we're not careful are going to slowly slip away to where we don't honor and respect each other. We talk past each other and not talk to each other. So that would be my advice. That's the advice that I give my daughter time and time again when she has questions about some of the images and comments that she sees on TV. Early on, she used to tell me, hey, that's not nice. Why would they say that? I said, exactly, it's not nice. And you aren't supposed to say that. So that would be my advice.
Michelle Perez.
Hi, Captain.
Hi.
You mentioned that there were mixed reactions at the protests you attended and that even the act of you hugging that young girl caused some of your colleagues to have different looks and different reactions towards it. So my question is, were there some of your fellow officers that were against the protests? And if so, how did they respond to them compared to how you did? And how did you communicate to those fellow officers that might have had a different opinion or perspective than yours?
Yeah, thank you for that. I talked a little bit about this earlier. It's just my perspective is different from where I grew up. And yeah, they did have a little bit of a different reaction than I did. But it's my role to try to bring that perspective and educate them on they don't have to agree, but offer it to them. And I will say that was back in June. I think a lot of officers have evolved in their understanding of what the protest was and what it wasn't. That's the main thing. What it wasn't is just to say, we hate the police. We don't like you guys. We don't appreciate you guys, all those other sorts of things. There were some people who said that, but in all, they just wanted police reform. They want the profession to advance. And you got to support that. You got to get behind that. So anyway, that would be my response to that.
Last question to Anthony Lucido. I know you've been waiting.
Hi, thank you, Captain. In the interview you had with Bob, one of the 3 things you said, which was important to do, is hire the right people. So what I'm curious is about what happens to the police officers that we have right now. Like, what are the challenges in retraining current officers? Because I feel it would be more difficult versus bringing in new people and essentially changing a department's culture.
Yeah, no, that's what the legislation is designed for. And each individual police agency has an obligation to ensure that their officers are well trained and prepared to deal with these type of situations. So yes, you do start with hiring the right people, but it's an ongoing mission of ours to constantly train our individuals because society evolves and policing has to evolve with society. The norms, the expectations, the challenges. And so it's never ending. There's no such thing as one-time training in the police and law enforcement profession. So it's an ongoing effort that we all have to commit to. And I'm hopeful that we will have the funding to do that as we move forward.
You know, I've done this for many years and we've only had an hour and 15 minutes. We got 21 questions in. That's extraordinary. But one of the things I'll say to you, Captain, is You're the type of person we need in the media talking about police perspectives while we're looking at that video. Because as I told the class, when we teach journalism, the pictures never tell the whole story, but the human reaction to it can be the prevailing story. So I hope someday that the media comes knocking on your door and suggests that you would be a great person to be on that set. And oh, by the way, they pay pretty well.
Well, you got my attention when you're talking about pay, but yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Good luck to all of you. I enjoy these type of conversations. And like I've said to Bob many, many times, whenever he needs me to come do something like this, I'm more than willing.
Well, you know, I'm going to hold you to that, so just count on that. And I know you're going to be working with Professor Kazem to do a special project this coming Friday. Students will be getting a notice about that in your email. You'll be joined by a variety of other police officers and other researchers about the concept of how do you talk to police in the year 2020. So I'll send everybody an email with that invitation. That's optional, it's not required. But thank you, Captain. We really appreciate you being here today.
Professor.
Thank you.
We're running out of time very quickly.
Okay, then it might
Michael,
not work
very
out.
quick.
I just want to say that my good student Ruth has been trying to get a question in Edgewise for the past like 30 minutes. I understand if there's no time, but I just want to like say like Ruth's been wanting, it's been kind of like she's just been trying to say something. I know there's not enough time, but if there's a way that she could still ask her question.
Quickly.
We've been going on the chat.
Quickly.
Like,
Quickly.
okay.
Anybody want to say something before we stop? Turn on your mics. Turn on your mics.
Okay, so I
Quickly.
grew up in Los Angeles. I'm actually 20 minutes away from Carson, Florida. You grew up. In your previous interview, you said that you were sick and sad and disappointed, betrayed, and outraged, overall angry. And like, I mean this in no judgmental way, but just like, how can you feel that and grow up in Los Angeles where there's a lot of police violence and still want to become a police officer? Like, how do you like?
That's a good question. Now that's a good question. Very quickly, Captain, why in the world would you want to be a police officer in this day and age?
Yeah, well, it goes back to my dad. Why wouldn't I? The motivation that he instilled in me is that if you want to affect change and you want to be part of things getting better, why wouldn't you join the organization to try to make the change from within? So my motivation, this is who I am. And so why wouldn't you want to have individuals that share my views of police needing to reform and change, to work within, to have a perspective of both the police and the community, to try to push change and make sure we accelerate that change to try to get to where we want to be.
My mother used to say the same thing in a different way. She says, you keep pointing to somebody else to do it. That somebody else is you. Let's see you do it. All right, folks, that's it for today. I'll see you on Thursday at noon. Great questions. Very proud of you. Thank you again, Captain.
Thank you.
Thank you, Captain.
Thank you.